We're at a very dangerous point in our nation's history. Polls show that voter confidence in our electoral systems is at an all-time low. In the 2020 election, the COVID-19 pandemic was used as justification for last-minute electoral procedure changes that did away with a number of anti-fraud measures. Those changes were enacted solely by Democrat officials in several states without authorization by the legislatures of those states. Whether those changes had a significant impact on election outcomes in those states isn't yet fully studied or known, but regardless, severe damage was done to voter confidence. Generally scant election integrity measures that vary from state to state are now coming under intense partisan attack in Washington. I believe that preserving integrity, transparency, and confidence in our elections is the most critical issue of our time. Minnesota's own former Congresswoman and presidential candidate Michele Bachmann recently presided over a 7-hour-long video conference on the subject of election integrity and the design of HR1, a Democrat-authored bill that aims to overturn state election laws across the nation, prevent ID requirements, and mandate unfettered, unverified election day registration for all. This absolutely professional and excellent conference was hosted by Regent University's Robertson School of Government. It includes esteemed speakers, Dr. Ben Carson, Wall Street Journal columnist and author of several books on election integrity, John Fund, Hans von Spakovsky of the Heritage Foundation, who formerly served on the Federal Election Commission. If you're as interested in this subject as I am, I strongly suggest you follow the link in the description to see the entire 7-hour conference. I recognize what a tremendous investment of time this is, so I've taken the liberty of creating this highlight video to hopefully convey the same urgent message with some degree of brevity. I urge you to get involved with this critical issue in Minnesota. Check out electionintegritywatch.org and the Minnesota Voters Alliance at mnvoters.org. Nationally, get acquainted with True the Vote and the Heritage Foundation, links to which will be in the video description.
My name is Michele Bachmann. I'm a former member of the United States Congress, and presently I'm serving as the Dean of the Robertson School of Government. Today's 7-hour conference is brought to you by the Robertson School of Government Master's Degree Program in Campaigns and Political Leadership. Dr. Ben Carson, many of you know him. He is the recent Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. He's a world-famous neurosurgeon. He's an author. He's a former presidential candidate, and he's everyone's favorite gentle giant. Ben Carson will give a keynote address on election integrity, followed by a time of question and answer.
I look forward to a robust exchange of ideas today, particularly, given the fact that so many people for too long have been concerned about some of the discrepancies in the 2020 election, but no one talks about it. It's sort of like someone stole the cookie from the cookie jar and then made a rule that no one can talk about the cookie jar. This is what's happening. But the founding fathers, they wanted a free and a vigorous discussion in the public square. And I'm very grateful for this opportunity today. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." Now, such consent is why we have elections. And it follows that election integrity is the foundation of every citizen's right to vote in a free and fair election. Now, in order to give our consent to be governed, we, the people, must believe in the underlying institutions that facilitate the election of those who govern, meaning that every lawful vote is counted, and only those who are eligible to vote actually do so. Merely bringing up questionable practices, as has been well documented, all of this voter fraud, if you do that, you get excoriated in the media. Now, why is that? It's because they have their own narrative to push, and they do it by shutting down any conversation about election abnormalities and, yes, fraud. Just contemplate that. even speaking about having honest and morally principled elections causes all kinds of uproars today. Well, I'm not about to be silenced into submission when we're talking about something that's so important to our republic, so important to our children, our grandchildren, all the people coming after us. We're in a real battle here. Election integrity, in my opinion, is one of the most important issues facing America today. And it's important that we get it right. Americans must have confidence in our institutions. As far as HR1 is concerned, instead of listening to what we, the people, want, the House recently passed HR1, the so-called, quote, for the People Act of 2021, unquote, which seeks to usurp the role of states and codify many of the issues we saw in last year's election. HR1, a blatant power grab by Washington, would impose an aggressive and likely unconstitutional federal takeover of states' election systems. I think it's worthy to note that the framers of the Constitution left details of voting to the state. Article 1, Section 4 says, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But the Congress may, at any time by law, make or alter such regulations. But HR1 goes far beyond and usurps states' ability to make their own regulations. The results it seeks are really quite questionable. In addition to taking over the state's election system, HR1 threatens First Amendment rights of citizens and organizations who engage in our political system and redirects federal dollars to subsidize political candidates. Now, through increased regulatory requirements, this regulation would increase the cost for organizations that choose to engage in the promotion of issues during election season. Under the guise of transparency, the bill's increased disclosure requirements would expose donors and members of conservative organizations to harassment that has become all too common in the era of cancel culture. And by empowering the IRS to examine the political and policy positions of nonprofits, this bill takes direct aim at the nonprofit status of organizations with a religious affiliation or who support traditional American values. This is the same playbook that racists in Alabama used in the 1950s. The Supreme Court rightly rejected the attempt at legalized harassment then, and liberals should be ashamed of their attempts to resurrect the ideal that the state should be in the business of harassing people who oppose progressive priorities. But perhaps most egregious of all, HR1 sets up a new campaign fundraising scheme where the US government directly subsidizes political campaign donations. Under the proposal, the federal government gives 6-to-1 matches for small dollar donations. That's craziness. And what you'll see popping up are advertisements on your TV, in your cell phone, and in your mailbox, all subsidized by taxpayer funds. If there is one immutable law of politics, it is that politicians will always vote to make their lives easier. This bill would direct massive amounts of federal cash into the campaign coffers of the very people who voted for it. I guess that's nice work if you can get it. Now, included in the nearly 800 pages of the bill's text is a veritable wish list of liberal election prescriptions, including mandates that states allow early voting, automatic voter registration, same-day registration, no-fault absentee voting, ballot harvesting, which is where political operatives collect absentee ballots from voters and drop them off at a polling place or election station. That of course, is a system ripe for abuse. And it prohibits voter identification requirements, prohibits election officials from verifying voter eligibility, and prohibits removing ineligible voters. Seems like if you really wanted to control elections forever, those are the things that you would do.
Mr. John Fund.
Thank you, Dean Bachmann. I was very impressed by Secretary Carson's keynote address. He covered all of the right bases. I'd like to fill in some of the points that he made. HR1 is the single worst piece of legislation I have ever encountered in 40 years covering Washington, D.C. Its index alone, just the table of contents, is 24 pages. It's 800 pages describing a federal takeover of state election laws, almost complete. Now, this is not how laws governing our election system should be handled. 1/3 of the country still believes that Hillary Clinton won the 2016 election. 1/3 of Hillary voters, I should say. They believe Russian interference, nefarious voter suppression, changed that election outcome. And Democratic representatives objected to the certification of electoral college votes when they were counted in 2017. 1/3 of Trump voters believe the election was stolen or their votes were not counted fairly. So we have 2/3 of the country basically lacking a fundamental trust in our election processes. How do we address that? We had a similar meltdown in public confidence after the 2000 Bush v. Gore race in Florida. And the response was completely different. The Help America Vote Act, which passed with the votes of a Democratic Senate, a Republican House, and signed into law by President George W. Bush, was a bipartisan piece of legislation. As its co-sponsor, Democratic Senator Chris Dodd said, this bill is designed to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. We're Americans. We can do both at the same time. Contrast that with the approach of HR1. There were no effective hearings on this bill. It was rammed through on a party line vote. Not a single Republican in the House of Representatives voted for it. This is not something that will inspire confidence in our elections. It will breed cynicism, mistrust, and despair. I'd like to address two aspects of HR1 which are not usually discussed, because I know the other speakers are far more grounded in the details. We are told that this is something that is demanded by the minority communities because Black, Brown, and Asian voters are victims of voter suppression, and they're calling out for action because their votes are not being counted or they're not being allowed to vote. Nothing could be further from the truth. Just to take voter ID laws, which are the most visible and most debated issue in the voter integrity realm, majorities of African Americans, Hispanics, and Asian Americans have always supported voter ID laws. It makes perfect sense for them that people should be asked to prove that they are who they say they are. And HR1 would wipe all of those laws out in 34 states. Effectively, it would allow anyone to show up in a state that has a voter ID law and say, well, I don't have an ID, but I say I'm this person and you have to let me vote. And they sign a piece of paper, which is never checked, and they vote. So this would go against the wishes of minority voters. And of course, as Hans von Spakovsky, my co-author, will outline, there is no evidence that election integrity laws have reduced turnout or prevented people from voting at the polls. What is not discussed is why do so many minorities support voter ID laws? Why in a 2016 poll for the Washington Post, a greater percentage of African Americans and Hispanic Americans said voter fraud was a serious concern than Caucasians? Why is that? Because many of the victims, and I would submit some of the most abused victims of voter fraud, are minorities. You ask yourself, Our major cities, Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, why are they so badly governed? Why are the roads so bad? The schools so miserable in educating kids? The public services so poor? It's often because machine one-party politics governs those cities. And the machines do one thing very, very well. They may provide poor public services, but they make sure they stay in power. And often in these areas where the minority population is very high, reformers will spring up and say, we can do something better. We can have more honest, effective government. And what does the machine do? It does everything to crush that opposition and to even steal elections. In Detroit, Kwame Kilpatrick, the Democratic mayor, was running for re-election. He had done an awful job. A reformer named Freeman Hendricks challenged him from the city council. The votes were stolen. There was clear evidence that they had been stolen. The city clerk of Detroit later had to resign in disgrace over the mishandling of absentee ballots. Kwame Kilpatrick went on to continue to drive the city of Detroit into bankruptcy, and he ended up serving time in federal public housing for fraud and other abuses. How much better Detroit would be off if that election had been conducted freely and fairly and Freeman Hendricks had won. In St. Louis, which is where Secretary Ashcroft is from in Missouri, what has happened in St. Louis? A longtime political machine has constantly crushed reform efforts. And in 2016, you had a political machine run by the Hubbard family, the matriarch of the family, who was in her 70s and had served for decades while the city deteriorated around her in the state legislature. She ran for re-election and was challenged by a 31-year-old man named Bruce Franks, a former gang member who'd cleaned up his act. He'd become active in the effort to try to clean up police corruption and police brutality. He was an entrepreneur, ran his own small business. He challenged and offered new leadership in that district. He was leading all of election night. Then in the last minute, a whole bunch of mysterious absentee ballots showed up. He ended up losing by 70 votes. He challenged the election because there were clear evidences of fraud. A federal judge actually ruled that the election was invalid and that the election had to be reheld in a month. So they had an election 6 weeks later, and it was held in the same district with the same candidates and the same set of issues. Bruce Franks won that runoff 71% of the vote. Now, I'm not saying that the difference was all made up by fraud, but clearly something had gone wrong in that original election. And I've spoken with Mr. Franks, and he says voter fraud is endemic and persistent in the St. Louis machine politics that he has to live with. And this is only two of many stories from Alabama, from Mississippi, from Philadelphia. Minorities often are the greatest victims of voter fraud. Now, the other thing I would point out on this is it would be nice to think that the people pushing HR1 are interested in solutions rather than a partisan power grab. I wish that I could think differently, but I can't. Let me just give you one example. On voter ID, this is something that the federal government under the Obama administration spent $100 million fighting state laws, trying to have them overturned, even though they had overwhelming public support and there was no evidence that they prevented people from voting. And in addition, liberal foundations and other groups have spent several $100 million trying to overturn these laws. So this is a stalemate that has gone on for a long time. And as Secretary Carson said, if there's anyone out there who lacks an ID, and I don't think there are very many because you can't function in a modern society today without one, you can't cash a check, you can't sign up for Medicare, you can't travel. If there's anyone who doesn't have an ID, let's get them one. And in 2015, during the Obama administration, a distinguished group of liberals gathered to celebrate the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was a signal accomplishment in opening up the vote. And they lamented the fact that there was the stalemate regarding voter ID. So they came up with an idea. It's called the Freedom Card. And the Freedom Card says, well, state IDs prevail. Every state can require an ID from a state. But if someone doesn't have one or forgot theirs or somehow doesn't have access to one, let's put a photograph costing 8 cents each on a Social Security card and make it freely available to people, and that can suffice as a voter ID. They took this idea to the White House under President Obama. The delegation included Bill Clinton, former President Jimmy Carter, Martin Luther King III, and Andrew Young, the former mayor of Atlanta and UN ambassador. They were told, oh, this is all very interesting, but we'd have to clear it with the Justice Department. It went over to Eric Holder. It languished for months. They finally got the Justice Department on the phone and asked, what's going on? And basically they were told that political figures in local communities had decided that this was not a good idea and they were not going to go forward with it. And also, sadly, I think the President Trump's administration was disorganized and sat on this idea. But this just goes to show you there are solutions, like what happened in 2002 with the Bipartisan Help America Vote Act. There are solutions to these problems, and there are solutions that can command bipartisan majority support. That is not what HR1 does. HR1 is a complete and total power grab. The Federal Election Commission has been in operation since the 1970s to ensure that its decisions have credibility. The membership is always divided 3-3. As it was when my co-author Hans von Spakovsky served on it. This would translate it into a majority rules system where a simple majority appointed by partisan figures could dominate the process and issue rules that disadvantage the other party and advantage the majority party. This is not democracy. This is not fairness. And the result, if HR1 passes, would be, I think, almost a tribal war, because you would have that 2/3 of Americans who already distrust the election system grow significantly. You would have pitched battles over the rules in a campaign rather than the issues. And you would have people taking office with no credibility and less ability to make decisions that people would respect, especially during a crisis like a pandemic. And it would lead to chaos, confusion, and I think a breakdown in fundamental respect for the rule of law. So HR1 is the single worst piece of legislation I've ever encountered in my time in Washington. It has to be fought. There are alternatives that can, in the words of Chris Dodd, back when the Help America Vote Act passed, that can make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. HR1 is completely the opposite. It basically throws open the vote to almost anyone who wants to pretend that they have a right to vote, who can vote twice, who can vote from out of state, who can vote if they're dead. Look, I believe in respect for our dead, but I also believe that we should have no representation without respiration. And HR1 would open a Pandora's box of horribles that we would regret for all the years that it would take for us to repeal it, which I think ultimately we would have to do because the chaos that would ensue would be so damaging.
Next, we'll hear from Hans von Spakovsky, a co-author with John Fund on election fraud issues, but also, again, he is the lead at Heritage Foundation on this important issue. Hans, take it away.
Dean, thank you so much for inviting me. John Fund is always hard to follow, but I will do my best. Look, he's given you the great historical view of this and the view from the 30,000-foot level. Let me get down a little more into the details of HR1, but two things that folks need to understand. First of all, this voter suppression meme that we've constantly heard now for the past few years from the mainstream media and others, that is basically a fake, phony expression that was formed as a result, I think, of focus groups on the left because it sounds so terrible. But I can tell you, the idea that there has been voter suppression going on in the United States is completely false. Okay, turnout in elections in this country, particularly the last few presidential elections, has been remarkably high. Not only that, but we've had turnout going up in many states like Georgia, for example, where they've had record turnout in recent years. And the idea that states are somehow putting in laws that suppress votes is also totally belied by the fact that if you look at turnout numbers, and let me give you a quick example of that. John mentioned voter ID. Look, we've got 10 years worth of data now, turnout data, on states that put in voter ID laws, places like Georgia and Indiana. And not only did turnout not go down, turnout went up, for example, in Georgia. After their ID law was in place in the first election in 2008, and particularly the turnout of minority voters, Black and Hispanic voters, increased, in fact, at a larger rate than that of white voters. So this idea that common sense election reforms somehow suppress votes is just totally untrue. And in fact, this is a phony narrative pushed by progressive left-wing advocacy organizations with their friends in the media for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to try to oppose any attempts to reform the election process. Second, look, the other narrative meme, which you constantly hear again, which is false, is that, look, there's just no election fraud in the United States, therefore we don't need to worry about it. We don't need to take any measures to prevent it. Or some people will admit that fraud actually occurs, but will say, oh, it's so minimal, we don't need to worry about it. Well, I'm sorry, but that's unfortunately not true too. We have enough fraud in this country that we need to worry about it, and we need to take steps to prevent it. In 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court, when it upheld Indiana's new photo ID law for voting, it specifically said the U.S. has a long history of election fraud. It's been documented by historians and journalists, and it could make the difference in a close election. And that, of course, is the key to this. We have close elections all the time in this country, particularly at the state and local level, and that's where it could make a difference. Like, for example, the case we added not too long ago to the election fraud database that we maintain at the Heritage Foundation of a mayor of a small town in Alabama who was removed from office after he was convicted of absentee ballot fraud, an election he won by 16 votes. Or the 9th congressional district race just 2 years ago, 2018, that was overturned in North Carolina for the same reasons, absentee ballot fraud and illegal vote harvesting. Or last summer, a municipal race in Paterson, New Jersey, that was overturned for locals were criminally charged and arrested for absentee ballot fraud by the state attorney general. And again, one of those elections was overturned because of that fraud. So it occurs, and we need to take common sense steps to prevent it. There are all kinds of other provisions in HR1 that simply are unconstitutional and that override state laws to the contrary. I'll give you one quick example of that, if I may. Look, the rules in every state on when felons get their right to vote back, or even if they lose it, are different. There's a very specific reason for that. The 14th Amendment explicitly gives states the ability to decide if a felon will lose his right to vote, and if he does, when he will get it back. There are 2 states in the country, actually, that you never lose your right to vote. You can vote from prison in Vermont and Maine, but other states, you do lose your right to vote when you're in prison, and when you get it back, in some states, it is automatic when you get out. Other states have a waiting period. This law would totally override all state laws on this and say that the moment someone is out of prison, they have to have their right to vote restored. This would override state requirements, such as Florida has put in, that says you won't get your right to vote back until you've not only completed your jail time, but you've also finished probation or parole or any restitution payments.
Next, we'll be hearing from Missouri Secretary of State Jay Ashcroft. I want to thank Jay for coming today. For what I understand from a very wise individual and a former U.S. Attorney General is that the elections in Missouri were one of the most boring elections in 2020 simply because they were run so well. So with that, thank you, Secretary of State Jay Ashcroft, for speaking to our conference today.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Regent University. And let me just thank my fellow panelists, John and Hans. I've had the pleasure of working with them on multiple occasions, and they have been doing great work for a long time to make sure that the people of this country and of the individual states are well represented and treated correctly in their elections. So I appreciate that. And I also appreciate that Hans did not take all of my stories about what happens in Missouri. And I'd really like to refer to something that the Democrats are telling you right now when they talk about HR1. They tell you that this is about making sure that our elections are run securely and correctly so that people can have faith in elections. That sounds good. But right now, at this very minute, those very same Democrats in Congress are trying to overturn a congressional election in Iowa. The 2nd congressional district of Iowa was a very close congressional race. It was separated by 6 votes. There was the election, they counted the votes, there was a hand recount, there was a certification. The losing party decided not to go to court and litigate, didn't have any ability to say there was fraud here, there were problems here, but went straight to the House of Representatives and is asking the very same individuals that say they want to have fair, secure elections to overturn the fair, secure election that happened in Iowa. So please keep that in mind when those very same people tell you that HR1 is for you. They are trying to use the idea that there were problems in the 2020 November election to totally take over our elections from the feds. And there were problems in the 2020 election. Generally, those problems, though, were not with state election laws. They were with elected officials that were not following the law, that were not following their state constitutions. We saw that in Pennsylvania, where they disregarded the constitutional prohibitions on who's allowed to cast absentee ballots, and where they did not follow a Supreme Court order to segregate ballots that were received late, since state law requires that ballots have to be received by a certain time. We saw that in Georgia, where a Republican Secretary of State, in essentially a sue and settle approach, changed state law on his own to totally eviscerate the ability to check someone's identification through signature verification. And that happened in multiple states. But I think everyone so far has talked about the bad things about HR1, and I want to leave you with some good information about HR1 and things that we can celebrate. And that is that it is entirely, completely unconstitutional, and that secretaries of state like me in Missouri and in other states will do 2 things immediately after this bill, if it gets passed and is signed by the president. 1, we will file a lawsuit because it's clearly unconstitutional in how it's written. And 2, we will ignore it because any sort of unconstitutional law is void from the beginning. I like to say that HR1 is unworkable, it's immoral, and it's unconstitutional. Sometimes I refer to that as the swamp trifecta. The United States of America can run elections well. We can run them in a way that people know that they were run well, and so that people can have confidence in them. We don't do that with HR1. We do that with certainty and accountability and transparency and auditability after the fact. We need to continue to do that. We need to allow states to make the decision as to how they do that. Now, one of the things I said toward the beginning was I mentioned how I believe this law was unconstitutional. And I want to talk about that in depth because you will hear talking heads at the federal level and for partisan purposes that will say it's not. But the US Constitution clearly gives voter qualifications, for the most part, to the state. Now, you will hear a lot of people talk about Article 1, Section 4, where it talks about time, place, and manner. But they will not talk about Article 1, Section 2, Clause 1, that defines who was allowed to vote in elections for the US House of Representatives. They will not talk about the 17th Amendment that defines who was allowed to vote in Senate elections. That was the 17th Amendment that gave us direct election of senators. And they will not talk about the presidential electors clause that gives legislatures the authority to determine how those electors are chosen. The times, place, and manner clause only applies to federal elections. So if the Constitution specifically gives the states the ability to determine who votes in US House of Representative races, US Senate races, and then of course, races for the president and the vice president, there is no constitutional basis for the US Congress to determine voter eligibility in those races beyond what the states have done. And it's not just those clauses. If you look at women's suffrage, that was changed, the 19th Amendment, that was changed by a constitutional amendment. If you look at refusing to allow poll taxes, that was a constitutional amendment. If you look at 18-year-olds, the right to vote, that was a constitutional amendment, the 26th Amendment. If you look at prohibitions about voting by race, that was the 15th Amendment. I'm happy to talk in detail about how this HR1 is unworkable, but most importantly, I want people to know that it is an unconstitutional encroachment upon the right of states in its current form. And in Missouri, as I said before, we will do two things if it passes and gets signed. We will file a lawsuit. I'm an attorney, I'm an engineer, I'm happy to do it myself. And then we will tell the federal government to pound sand, because we will follow the Constitution regardless of what the United States Congress does. Thank you very much.